we represent the African diaspora around the globe. We represent the fact that our culture has roots in all the other cultures. You know what I mean? Our presence is known on every continent prior to the European history books. You know, and knowing that gives yourself a sense of pride that wasn't there before, especially for Black Americans, where we only know about being descendants of slaves. Yeah. Well, that doesn't really give you much pride. But with this show, it's so important to me because we're showing people that it was so much more than that. You know, you're descendants from kings and queens and philosophers and mathematicians and people who pretty much set the foundation for civilization for all the other cultures to have come and gone and currently exist.
And we discussed this a lot of times on the Culture Show, how media has depicted on the African continent, media has depicted African Americans to be gangsters, pimps, hoes, rappers, all of these different things, gang members, violence. And vice versa. On the flip side, Africa has been painted as impoverished, war, poverty, you know, disease, Ebola, AIDS, flies flying around children's heads. It seems that the media has played a pivotal part in dividing the diaspora. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And it's been that way before media was known as media. You know, media has taken so many different forms for thousands of years. Plays are a form of media. Press is a form of media. Stories, like in ancient times, they would call a storyteller a bard in certain areas. You know, that's a form of media. And the media has definitely gone above and beyond to keep us separate and to demonize us in some way, shape, or form, or to make us appear less than. And a lot of the times you find that people are kind of, some people, I should say, are playing into that. And you're not helping to paint the picture in a better light by playing into it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the media, and this is why this platform was created. This platform was created to change and to diversify the narrative that mainstream media has created by putting cultures against cultures, religion against religion, race versus race, all of these things. And Chey, you mentioned on your show a quote that you said, "We're all the same people." What did you mean by "we're all the same people"?
We're all the same people, meaning that we all come from the same cradle of life.
Exactly. And that's also an interview that we had with Jane Elliott, and she mentioned the same thing, that we're all one race, one people. The idea of white superiority is a myth. It's something that was used as a tactic to enslave a race at the time that was quite diverse. I mean, the African continent still to this very day is a very diverse place. I think people forget that Africa is not a country. It's a continent of many different countries.
It's a huge continent. In fact, all the other continents fit into Africa at once.
Absolutely. For those who don't know, in the 13th and the 14th century, Mali was the richest kingdom in the world at that time. This was what you may know as Mansa Musa Abu Bakari II, rulers of ancient Mali. So a rich continent at the time, and it actually was a time where the world became awakened on the riches that sub-Saharan Africa had. Sub-Saharan Africa, I don't even like that term, but what they call today sub-Saharan Africa had, because Europe knew about Egypt. Europe knew about Kush, but they didn't really know what was going on in Central, Western, and South Africa, particularly when it came to resources. And when Mansa Musa traveled on his pilgrimage to Mecca, Mansa Musa dropped off so much gold in Egypt and so much gold in Mecca, and he had 100,000 soldiers with him. And an article came out in Arabia, and it spread to Europe about the wealth of this black man in Central Africa, Western Africa. And from then on, mercenaries were sent out to discover who was Mansa Musa, who is he, and what is the source of his wealth. And we noticed what happened shortly after. When 1492 came, we know the pillaging of Africa began. We know about the 1884 with the Council of Berlin, where Africa really suffered. And we also know about what happened with transatlantic slave trade. So when you mentioned that we were all the same people, it's very ironic, Sister Chey, that the curriculums start at the 1400s and up. Why do you think that is?
Ironic or well placed? How do I think that is? Mm-hmm. I think that if you're going to make a people submissive, I think that if you are going to be able to keep the slaves the way that you want them, you have to keep their mind at a certain level. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have the mentality that, you know what, I'm just a descendant of slaves, you're going to hold a very, I won't say that it's like up on the forefront, but like subconsciously, you're going to hold that as kind of like a shame. It's going to be, you know, you're not going to be proud of that per se. You know, you get some people like, you know, I'm just a slave. We made it through. That's great. But that's not the same level of confidence as saying I am the descendant of a king and a queen. Mm-hmm. I'm descendant of a civilization that the world was completely envious of and did their best to break it.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It holds a different level of pride. So if you're going to keep a people, you know, subjugated and enslaved mentally and physically, you have to create a curriculum that's going to keep it that way. We know the systematic oppression rolls from financial to educational to the jail system. Mm-hmm. You know, it affects even the family dynamic. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to keep these people in their place, we have to be able to teach them what we want them to know, which is before you were slaves here, you were swinging on the vines in Africa, running with the lions, and then we came and civilized you. Mm-hmm. And that's not true.
The knowledge about ancient Kemet is rising. For those who are listening who don't know much about Kemet, the name Kemet is ancient Egypt. This is what Egypt was called, which means the Black Land or land of the blacks. But this is what ancient Egypt was called by the ancient Egyptian people. The term Egypt didn't come until the Greeks took over Egypt, okay, which was in the 32nd dynasty of Egypt. So that term was not, the term Egypt or Egyptian was not used by these original ancient Egyptian people. Let's get that very clear. So the rise of Kemite knowledge has really caused a lot of problems for modern day Egyptology, which has whitewashed a lot of ancient African kings, queens, what have you, artifacts. We can go on and on about the things that happen. Why do you think that Kemet studies is so important for Africans in the diaspora to know about when it comes to reclaiming their history?
Malcolm X said, the black man has become so dulled down that he could look at a picture of himself and not even see himself. Mm-hmm. You know, and the fact that we can see these, you know, let's take media for an example, since we brought it up already. Mm-hmm. Let's think about Cleopatra. Who played Cleopatra? That the most famous role.
What's her name? Elizabeth Taylor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Taylor plays Cleopatra, and all you see is this. And don't get me wrong, I love Elizabeth Taylor. She's actually one of my favorite actresses. She's wonderful. Like, you know, rest in peace for her. But you see this white woman playing a role that was not originally meant for her to play, basically. I'm trying to be nice when I say this. But it's important for us to realize and look over there and see ourselves, because we do come from there. We may not come from that exact region. You know, a lot of us don't know what part of Africa we come from.
Right.
But as a whole diaspora, that is our home. We can have pride in the fact that, you know, we came from, some of us came from slaves here, and that our families made it through, you know, the struggle and the humiliation and the torture. But we also need to have a bigger sense of pride that these people were so jealous. They did everything in their power that they could to tear us down.
Yeah, they say history belongs to the victors, you know, and
his story.
His story, exactly.
His story.
You know, I think it's important for people to connect with ancient Africa, not just Africans in the diaspora. I think the whole world needs it to know, for the simple fact that ancient Africa is the beginning of all human life. It's the beginning of all civilization. Even if you turn around a dollar bill, you see a pyramid there. A shout out to Dr. Sally Ann Ashton, and as well as shout out to Solange Ashby, the only Black Egyptologist. We had them on the Culture Show when we did the radio show. And shout out to my dear friend, Vanessa Davies, who's also been very strong with speaking the African origins of ancient Egypt. But one thing I learned from those Egyptologists is that in the early stages of Egyptology, it was really the goal to connect biblical studies to ancient Egypt. And the first thing they had to do with connecting biblical studies was to separate Egypt from Africa. Because if you make the connection between Egyptians being African or Black, as we call it today, it would be very hard to separate the Israelites from Black as well. Who were very well mixed with the Egyptians. I mean, even the Bible mentions Joseph being in Egypt most of his life, Moses growing up in Egypt and always being called an Egyptian. Even when he left Egypt, he had an appearance of an African man somewhat. So they had to separate Egypt from Africa in order to create what they call today Egyptology and promote white superiority. So shout out to Jane Elliott as well, because she came on the Culture Show, and you guys who have subscribed can also go check out that interview of Jane Elliott, where she mentioned you cannot continue to promote white superiority if you can admit that all those wonderful things that we got from Egypt came from Black people, end quote.